This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy: How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com. Thank you, and may God bless you. Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, inside the mind of Vladimir Putin. With us this evening, Dr. Andrei Illarionov, the former senior policy advisor to Vladimir Putin. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, run by our friend Frank Gaffney. Dr. Illarionov, welcome to the Glazov Gang.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's begin by talking a little bit about your background. You studied economics at the Leningrad State University. You received a PhD in economics in 1987, if I'm correct. And in April 2000, you were invited by Vladimir Putin to be a senior economic advisor. This is quite a journey. Introduce yourself a little bit to our audience in terms of your background.
Essentially, you said everything correctly. So main steps in my biography are already covered. So I'm originally from St. Petersburg. I graduated from the university from economics department. I worked at the research centers, for number of research centers in the 80s and 90s. I joined the Russian government in 92. I was an economic advisor to the former Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, and after that to Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin. After that, I established my own think tank, Institute of Economic Analysis. And as you correctly already said, in April year 2000, I had been invited by Vladimir Putin to be his economic advisor. I was at this position for 6 years, almost 6 years, and for almost 5 years, I was Sherpa, Russian Sherpa. It's kind of the personal advisor and assistant to the Russian president in G7/G8 club of the largest economies of the world. After year 2000, in year 2005, I resigned from my position of economic advisor and Sherpa. I went back to my institute, and in year 2006, I've been invited by the Cato Institute here in Washington, D.C., and I worked there for a number of years. Now I'm working with the Center for Security Policy, as you mentioned already, in a great team of the center.
Well, fantastic. Let's go back in time now and just fill in the timeline here. We're from the same country, Doctor, so I feel very close to you for many reasons, including the fact that my parents were dissidents in the Soviet Union, and you have very nobly and bravely taken a stand for freedom in terms of Russia, which means a lot to me. Just on a personal note, before we begin, I've always been very touched by how much Russians love their literature. My dad brought me up. We were always at the dinner table discussing Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov. And in my youth, the Brothers Karamazov and Capital Punishment very much influenced me and left an indelible mark in my Russian soul, one could say. Could I ask you any particular novel or author in your youth, or even till this day, that was remarkable for you or that influenced you?
You're a very special person, Jamie. I need to confess that nobody in the United States ever mentioned those topics that you are talking right now. And that is why I especially appreciate that your special respect and special attachment to the Russian literature and to Russian culture. As for me, probably the closest authors among Russian writers are Nikolai Gogol and Anton Chekhov. Those two persons somehow very close to my mind, very close to my heart. and extremely good in expressing what people do think and how do they react to the actions of themselves and other people. And especially
Absolutely.
Chekhov is a person who personally followed a very strict moral conduct, a very particular code of conduct, and he is famous for creating the so-called code of decent person, which is actually attracted. He was the author that my father uh, loved very much, and he attracted my attention to his works, and I completely share his approach to this. One of the greatest, if not the greatest, authors in the Russian literature history.
So beautiful, Doctor. Thank you. And in terms of Putin and the monstrosity that we see today, it didn't just come out of thin air. We know that Russia, the Soviet Union, we have a very painful past in terms of the totalitarianism, in terms of Lenin and Stalin and the Soviet regime. And when you were growing up, what was the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn or Varlam Shalamov's Koloma Tales or Pasternak or Osip Mandelstam, were these books available, or was it dangerous to read them during your youth, or were you able to access them?
First of all, it's so nice to talk to you because you are very familiar with the situation in the current Russia in the former Soviet Union, and you definitely know, and our listeners also should know about that. That during time of the Soviet Union, all these books and all those authors were banned,
Uh-huh.
and those who would have access to those books, or who would possess those books, or who would read those books, would risk very substantial punishment, including incarceration. So, fortunately, and many people just didn't know about the existence of those authors. Fortunately for myself, my father and my mother were very good, not only parents, but also very good teachers who showed me, who introduced me to this part of the national culture and to these great authors. So that is why, from relatively early in my age, I was able to read those stuff that you have mentioned. And also, I was listening to radio stations like Voice of America, like the Radio Liberty, like BBC, Deutsche Welle, that were absolutely forbidden in the former Soviet Union, and who could be caught by listening to those radio stations could have a very serious risk for themselves. So, but I was fortunate in this regard.
And I have a guess why I also discuss that and ask you that is when I study your history, when I study your record, it touches my heart so much because there would be many officials in the Putin government that would see things and just turn away. But in terms of what happened at the Beslan school, in terms of the theft that was engaged by Soviet leaders, the money that they were stealing, again, what happened at Beslan, you resigned because of those things. There was something in your conscience that didn't sit right with you. Tell us a little bit about this journey of yours where you saw this barbaric nature of the government that you were working for and how you resigned.
First of all, probably I need to tell why I joined the government, because it was not a secret for me that the coming president, he was not yet elected that time. When we first met with Vladimir Putin, I knew that he was from KGB. He was a colonel in this organization, security organization, which me myself, as well as my family, as well, all my good friends knew that as any distant person should not have any contact with those people. And that is why when he invited me for the first time to be his economic advisor, I refused. And I refused due to many reasons, but certainly one of the reasons was exactly what we're discussing. And it's like a recommendation from my late father that to have nothing common with this organization. But after that followed another invitation, which I also declined, and only during the third invitation, after thinking more than 2 months, I decided, yes, probably it's time to try. And the reason why I did it because I found that time in the late winter and spring of year 2000, Vladimir Putin was a person who did know nothing about economics, and he was genuinely interested in economics, in rational, reasonable economic policy that could bring prosperity to the Russian people. And I saw him many times. I participated with him in many meetings. I traveled with him to many places around the country. And to my surprise, I found in him genuine interest of a person who really would like to make good changes in the life of millions of citizens. That time, back in year 2000, I shared the theory, the approach that later I found incorrect, but then I thought it was reasonable. The concept is very well known in the United States as well, because it has been promoted by such a person like Francis Fukuyama about this kind of the end of history and all this stuff. And the concept was such that first of all, you need to bring prosperity to the country. And based on this prosperity, you can create a middle class, which would produce a demand for democracy, for liberty, for rule of law, for human rights. And that is why it is still possible to get good results if you would take this path. First of all, to create prosperity, at least some level of prosperity for people, based on which you can build political institutions. Several years later, and based on my experience, I found that this is a wrong concept. This concept is not supported by the real life. But back then, I shared this view, and I decided for myself, okay, why don't I try to use this unique opportunity to be economic advisor to the president and to try to implement rational economic policy to produce economic growth, because Russia then was for 9 years in the longest and deepest recession and depression in its history. The Russian GDP fell by more than 40%, and the living standards of population collapsed, and the level of unemployment and the level of criminality was incredibly high. So that is why I thought, if I will be able to contribute to curement of all economic and social problems, maybe it would contribute to construction, to building democratic and liberal and legal institutions of free society. And that is why I joined this team. And to put it kind of brief, not to talk much, to a very high extent, I succeeded, because the economic policies that I recommended to Putin and to the cabinet was extremely successful. It was altogether 10 years of the best economic growth in the history of Russia recorded. Within 10 years, Russian GDP doubled in real terms. Russian GDP per capita doubled, and our personal consumption per capita in real terms increased by 2.3 times. So this is the best period in economic history of Russia for all its existence. So that is why I feel myself a little bit satisfied, because the economic policies that I recommended did contribute really to lifting millions of people in the country from extreme poverty to let's say middle income level, and actually helped, I hope, lives and health of many millions of people. But as I learned myself, as all my compatriots learned, the good economic policy does not guarantee a liberal or human approach to other issues by the government. And because of that, because I saw from very short distance the behavior of people who were around me, including my former boss and all other people around him, because they used the power of the state against people when they did this Beslan story, when they use flamethrowers against people who have been caught in this school, and they killed with tanks, with shelling by tanks, and with flamethrowers, more than 330 people. First of all, kids, their parents, and teachers, and many other things that I decided that I cannot stay with this government anymore. I try to do something within the government, trying to explain and to oppose such policies, but certainly we understand that what can be done by the advisor it's not something that is being done by the president. So at some point, I understood that it will continue unopposed, and my continuing presence within the government would be only demonstration that I agree with such an approach, with such a policy, which was absolutely unacceptable for me, and that is why I resigned from this position in December 2005.
Well, thank you so much for taking a stand for justice and for freedom, Doctor. When we think of Beslan, for instance, I think back a little bit to 1999 and the apartment buildings that were blown up. And as we know, Litvinenko and Yuri Feltushinsky did their own investigation. And some would say, and they suggested, if that's a light word to use, that the KGB had actually done that to solidify Putin's regime and also to wage war on Chechnya. Is the KGB capable of things like that?
It is not. It is not only capable. It has been done by KGB, but its name now is not KGB. It's FSB, but it's the same people.
Yeah.
And when I joined the government, I did know this story. Actually, unfortunately, I did not pay much attention to that. But after that, I studied the story, and when I was in the government, this position, I found the truth, and it is also was one of the most important factor contributing to my decision to resign. And after that, I did a lot of research, academic research, and I tried to identify the regime. And I call this regime that is run by corporation. I call this corporation. It's corporate regime, but the corporation of the current and former officers of KGB, FSB, and other special forces in Russia. And this title corporation became very actively used. And the person whom you already mentioned, Yuri Feltushinsky, wrote his book, and he used these terms that I invented or I used in description of this regime, corporation, for his book. Also, he used my testimony to the U.S. Congress that I gave in, I believe, in year 2008 about the corporation of the current and former KGB/FSB officers.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I've studied your interpretations, and overall we see that, first of all, Putin talked a lot about joining NATO in the first couple years. And then all of a sudden his attitudes had changed. And you have commented that the war in Iraq in 2003 somehow changed Putin and his vision of things. Could you talk a little bit about what Putin was talking about in his first couple years, then all of a sudden the Iraq war, and then we saw a new Putin that was all of a sudden launching war on dissidents like Khodorkovsky, and in many respects becoming more expansionist, if one could say?
First of all, Jamie, I need to confess that I'm completely shocked by the level of your knowledge about what I was doing and what I was writing about. My understanding, I have a great appreciation to what you have done, just to follow my writings and my statements and my comments. Thank you very much for that. As for these stories that you're asking about, that is really in the center of the discussion for many years, and probably will be for many years in future, because this is one of the most shocking changes in the position of the one of the most influential, most powerful persons in the world. The person who came to power in year 2000 with a program of modernization of Russia, of Europeanization, or even westernization of Russia. And if we would look into year 2000, year 2001, year 2002, it would be a honeymoon. It was a real honeymoon between the Russian leadership and the Western countries. I'm talking not only about Tony Blair from United Kingdom, but also about George Bush Jr., who then was the U.S. president. And the relations that have been built by Putin with Tony Blair and with George Bush and with other Western leaders was unprecedented. During this war in Iraq in year 2003, it was a famous saying by Condoleezza Rice when all of a sudden George Bush administration found that they have opposition to this war in Iraq from Germany, France, in Russia. And then Condoleezza Rice said to ignore Germany, Germany to ignore, France to punish, and to continue work with Russia. This is a direct citation. And it meant not so much countries that she mentioned, but the leaders who were at that time in those countries. So that is why she, as well as U.S. administration, did not find extremely useful leaders of Germany and France, unlike leader of Russia, of Putin. So that is why Putin produced very strong impression, not only on Russian population, not only on expert community, but on the Western leaders, because they found him much more ready for real reforms, for westernization, compared, let's say, to Boris Yeltsin or even to Mikhail Gorbachev. So the question arises, how it was possible that such a person who considered them as a very close partner, even closer than Germany and France. This is a shocking fact for Western alliance. As you say, all of a sudden, but maybe not very sudden, but nevertheless, it was step by step. Nevertheless, turned out to be not only opposition but enemy of the West, and who is now waging very radical anti-Western policies, not only aggressive wars against Georgia, Moldova, Syria, Ukraine, number of conflicts in Africa, but very anti-Western policy in Europe and against the United States with all this ideology. Certainly, we do not know yet the all details, and maybe those people who would write the correct synopsis how it has happened would win sometimes Nobel Prize for solving this puzzle. But my reading of these events, especially from my distance, relatively short distance that I saw from inside, there was a partially gradual evolution, I always say maybe devolution of personal psychology and personal ideology and personal mindset of Vladimir Putin towards the surrounding world. And the crucial points would be several of them. One of them you already mentioned, year 2003, Iraq war. And then Putin actually tried many times to contact with George Bush and with other members of the Bush administration just to convince him that the way to deal with Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein then was not the best one to solve those problems, especially as we all now learned, and we definitely knew, that Hussein did not develop those weapons of mass destructions that have been presented for public consumption.
Mm.
But another crucial event has happened in evolution of aggressive policies from Mr. Putin would be another one that I never mentioned yet, and I would use, with your permission, your show to share with you as with your listeners this particular event, if you don't object.
I do not object and welcome it highly.
You mentioned, and we don't definitely know that when Mr. Putin came to power in year 2000, he was a very big fan of NATO and a very big supporter of Russia joining NATO. And it was official position of the Russian leadership, official, public, and non-official, non-public. Me, myself, participated in a number of diplomatic negotiations between Putin himself on one side and Western leaders on the other side, when we discussed whether it's possible for Russia to join NATO. And the first step on this path was Russia joining G7, G8. And me personally was in charge of this process. I became Sherpa for Putin, and my purpose of my actions was to bring Russia to full-fledged membership of G7 and transforming it into G8, which was achieved in year 2002. And that success gave to Russian leadership as well to Western leadership some basis to believe that if appropriate policies will be continued, at some point the Russian membership in the NATO is possible. So that is, and Mr. Putin was interested in joining NATO himself and for Russia, and he did not object at all NATO membership for Baltic countries. They joined in year 2004. Ukraine joining NATO in year 2002. During press conference, he publicly said, this is an issue for only Ukraine and NATO, and there is no place for Russia, because this is a business of sovereign nation Ukraine and sovereign international organization of NATO. So in year 2007, the same person, Mr. Putin, speaking at Munich Conference on Security in February year 2007, said absolutely opposite. It is absolutely impossible for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. And he himself said that, okay, Russia and NATO cannot be, there is no place for Russia in NATO. The question arises, what happened between early years of Putin's presidency in year 2007, when he took a very opposite position? And I can give you one more hypothesis, one more element in this thinking. This thinking is a person, the person who appeared in Moscow in year 2005 and stayed in Moscow until year 2008. And that person became incredibly influential for Mr. Putin, with whom Mr. Putin met several times. And after that person was departing from Moscow, Mr. Putin organized a special party for him. And this is the only case that I know for his more than 2 decades in the presidency, that Putin organized a special party in some kind of cherishing, thanking, with gratitude to anyone at such level. You know the name of that person? And by the way, when Mr. Putin was organizing this particular party, he made a speech that is still available on the Kremlin website, both in Russian and English, and everybody can go to the website, find this speech, and just to check what he said. And Putin said, "We're extremely grateful to you for your enormous help for us, that help us to understand the modern world. Nobody could help us as you, and we will be always grateful to you for this enormous contribution to our understanding. And it was in year 2008, after Munich speech of Mr. Putin, saying that NATO is enemy and Ukraine and Georgia should never be a members of NATO.
Very fascinating, Dr. Illarionov. We're going to just take a quick break with our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell. Years ago, when I invented My Pillow, I was faced with every adversity you could think of. No retailers wanted to sell My Pillow. That's come full circle. Vendors took advantage of me, and I was copied by China. Well, by the grace of God, I was able to get through all that and learn from it. I have a passion to help other U.S. entrepreneurs, and that's why I created my new platform, mystore.com. We have hundreds of products from amazing entrepreneurs, and to celebrate, I'm going to put My Pillows on mystore.com right now. You can get my standard My Pillows regularly $69.98, now only $19.98 with your promo code. Or you can get my standard queen size, regular $79.98, now only $29.98. Or you can get my premium king size, regularly $89.98, now only $34.98. So go to mystore.com and use that promo code on your screen to get huge discounts on all My Store products. Thank you and God bless.
And we are back with Dr. Andrei Illarionov, former economic policy advisor to Vladimir Putin. Doctor, let us return now to Putin's, I guess what we could describe as his new mindset, quote unquote. But you were a little bit of a prophet. I think you are a little bit of a prophet, because you had made a warning even back in March 2014, and I want to tie that into something. There are many people, including conservatives, who have this interpretation that Putin just wants peace, he just wants to be left alone, and NATO is circling and suffocating Russia, EU, NATO, America encircling Russia, getting Putin paranoid. But you have also been close to this individual's mind, and this is an individual who saw the fall of the Soviet regime and the Soviet Empire as a catastrophe. And he wants to bring back, if not the Soviet Union, but at least parts of the Soviet Union. And you have talked about how Putin dreams about not just Ukraine, but Belarus and Moldova, the Baltic states. He has this vision of a historic Russia. This is really what the invasion of Ukraine today is about, isn't it? It's not about that the West was somehow provoking him.
Jamie, I need to repeat once again how much I'm impressed by your knowledge of what I am saying and writing.
And I appreciate that very much, and I didn't finish. In 2014, I apologize, you had warned that Putin was going to do these things. But go ahead, and you can start with your compliment again. A compliment can never go too far with me. Thank you.
It's true. Now, but I need to confess that you are first American, first person in this world outside of Russia who paid attention to the concept of historic Russia, and who said that this is the essence of mindset of Mr. Putin: historic Russia, not the former Soviet Union, not USSR, not something else, but historic Russia, the concept that did not exist before 1991, the concept that had been invented by some Russian imperialists or neo-imperialists in 1990s, and was a very marginal among people who who thinking about Russia, about history, about future. It was not only not popular, it was largely unknown even in Russia. But Putin picked up this concept, and he developed this concept not only as a so-called theory, but also he tried to implement into practice. So what we could see over the last 2 decades, at least in the last maybe 15 years, it's attempts to implement this concept into practice with attack on Georgia, and with occupation of 20% of Georgian territory, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, with attack on Ukraine, with occupation and annexation of Crimea first, and after that with occupation of Donbass and with the current war against Ukraine, with the meddling in Moldova, with attempts to occupy and annex Belarus, and definitely with attempts to attack one day Baltic countries. All of this is a concept of historic Russia. And in one of his articles, Vladimir Putin has described where are western borders of this historic Russia. And he openly said that western borders of historic Russia are western borders of the Russian Empire at the end of 18th century. We can take historic maps and we would find that western borders of the Russian Empire at the end of 18th century, it's after the three divisions of the Rzecz Pospolita, the Kingdom of Poland and Principality of Lithuania. So that is why the historic Russia, according to Mr. Putin, includes most part of Ukraine, all Belarus, all Baltic countries, and part of Moldova, or maybe all Moldova. So that is why each time when we can think about what are real appetites of Putin, real imperial appetites, we need to remember his definition of historic Russia. And that is why he's interested. By the way, just a few days ago, you might saw it. He made a special statement during the Security Council meeting in Moscow, in which he attacked Poland for all mistakes and crimes that Poland committed for all historic life of this nation and this state. And it is surprise, he mentioned twice the term historic. First of all, he said historic Ukrainian lands that must belong to Poland, meaning Lviv and the territory surrounding Lviv. And after that, he said about historic Russian gubernia. Based on this, we can say that by saying that in application to Poland, Putin made a public statement for his desire to annex Belarus, because he was talking about the Western Belarus that was the subject of discussion between Poland and Soviet Union in 1939, and he was referring to those historic Russian gubernias for Western Belarus. So that is why it's the first time that he said so publicly. So that is why his interest in annexing not only Ukraine, but some other countries did not disappear. They did not evaporate during this war against Ukraine. They continued to be with him, and he continued to think about acquiring other chunks of the so-called historic Russia.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating, also very sobering and quite frightening. Doctor, under Obama, Putin hits Crimea, goes into Crimea. For 4 years of Trump, Putin does nothing. Trump hits Russian mercenaries in Syria, Putin does nothing. And then Biden comes in, who right now is being painted as this great protector of Ukraine. But it's very interesting that in the beginning, he was winking to Putin that he could go in. In many respects, we see an invitation. He even made several statements about, oh, well, a little incursion is not a real aggression. Tell us a little bit about this. And I myself, Dr. Illarionov, I don't really think Biden is really trying to help Ukraine in a genuine way. There's something very fishy going on. Let me hand that to you.
Once again, I only say how unbelievable, this conversation for me during all my years in the United States, because how well you understand two worlds, Russian worlds as well as world of American politics. You're absolutely
Thank
right
you.
that
Thank you.
all attacks, all aggressions that Putin was able to launch and succeed happened under Obama. In year 2014, Putin occupied and annexed Crimea. After that, he launched war in Donbass. In year 2015, he went to New York to the United Nations General Assembly meeting, specially to meet with President Obama to do what? To conclude an agreement that he, Putin, could move his troops to Syria and to do his attacks in Syria against Syrian civilian population. And we know how Russian planes bombed Aleppo, with thousands of people killed by Russian bombs. That has happened not only because Mr. Obama was in the White House, but it was done by invitation of Mr. Obama for Putin's troops to come to Syria. When Mr. Biden became president, and he was, as we all know, he was a vice president under Obama, we see some repetition of history, but only in much larger scale. The crucial element, your suspicion is absolutely correct. We can mention many, many events when Biden administration and Biden himself, he said, minor incursion is not incursion. When Biden withdrew American instructors who trained Ukrainian military from Ukraine back to the United States, Biden administration withdrew all American citizens from Ukrainian territory. Biden administration withdrew U.S. ships, Navy from Black Sea. Finally, Biden administration withdrew U.S. embassy from Kiev to Lviv first, and after that to Poland. Moreover, it was not only withdrew embassy, it destroyed all equipment in the U.S. embassy in Kiev. Nothing similar happened even in Kabul when the United States was forced to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. This is absolutely without any precedent. So that is why we thought for these 16 months of the war that it was some kind of green light. There was some kind of invitation for Putin to attack Ukraine. And I believed it for all the 16 months until July 6th this year. But on July 6th, the magazine Newsweek published an article by William Arkin, which I recommend strongly to read and to enjoy this text. Because in this article, Mr. Arkin, that he had more than a dozen interviews with the high officials from CIA, from intelligence community of the United States, high officials from Pentagon, White House, and others. And he reported to all of us that was an agreement concluded by Mr. Burns, CIA director, and Mr. Putin in November 2021 in Moscow, where Mr. Burns has been dispatched by Mr. Biden, officially so-called under pretense to warn Putin against invasion. But essentially, as a Newsweek article describes, it was an agreement between two sides how to proceed aggression against Ukraine, with obligations taken by both sides. American Biden administration took obligations not to attack Putin personally, not to destroy Putin's regime, and not to look for regime change, not to allow Ukrainians to attack Russian territory. That is obligation on the American side. Obligation that Putin took on his side is just to limit his attacks only Ukrainian territory. So that is why what we suspected for a long time. Now
Yes.
we have a confirmation from the first-hand sources. They told us that was an agreement how to attack Ukraine and what to get from Ukraine. And this is what is important. Newsweek is not a Republic-leaning magazine. It is a Democratic-leaning magazine. Mr. Arkin himself is not opponent of Mr. Biden or opponent of Democratic administration. He is a staunch supporter of Democrats. So that is why his work cannot be considered as a politicking, like a opposition to this regime. No, he wrote this article just to praise work that Biden administration and CIA Director Burns did in achieving this agreement how to attack Ukraine. I would say that reading this article, it is impossible not to come to conclusion that this visit of Mr. Burns to Moscow in November 21 will be put sooner or later on the same level as visit of Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Nazi Germany, on August 23rd, 1939, to Moscow, and concluding with Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that opened the war, the Second World War in Europe, with attack of Wehrmacht on Poland on September 1st, 1939.
And Doctor, in closing, we just have a couple minutes left. We definitely would like to bring you back for a round two. So much left to discuss, but let's end with this. I would like to ask this very quickly. I think that Putin miscalculated. I think he was very badly advised. And we hear that some people around him that gave him this bad advice were quote unquote punished in certain ways. Let me just hand that to you. There was a miscalculation and he had received some bad advice?
Yes and no. He miscalculated one thing, but this is a really very serious miscalculation. He didn't, he underestimated ability of Ukraine to resist, to fight back. By the way, it is the same miscalculation that has been done by Biden administration and by CIA. In that article that we discussed briefly, Mr. Arkin says very openly that it was a very grave miscalculation of CIA to underestimate ability of Ukraine to resist, and was overestimation of ability of Russia to attack. So this is a miscalculation. But what was not a mistake, but it was a real achievement of Putin, is ability to conclude the most important agreement with the most powerful country, with administration of the most powerful country in the world. And as we learned through all these 17 months of this new stage of the war, this agreement is still in place. Mr. Burns called Mr. Naryshkin, head of intelligence service in Russia, on June 24th, expressing his reassurance to Mr. Naryshkin and to Ms. Putin. That was a confirmation that the agreement concluded in November 21 is still valid. And this is probably the most important demonstration that in some part of his calculations, Putin was not mistaken.
I see. Dr. Illarionov, they say when Stalin was signing the order for the massacre, the Katyn forest, tens of thousands of murders, other murders, he's just signing these, and then he has a good night's sleep. Does Putin lose any sleep over the amount of people that are dying and suffering because of him in this war?
I would say that probably he is missing this part of his brain or character or heart that is responsible for empathy. He does not have this element at all. Moreover, it looks like that he has some kind of demand, his personal demand and his desire to torture people and to kill people.
Little bit of the words demon, psychopath, and sociopath come to mind, but that's for our next conversation. There's many people who see this as the Ukraine-Russia war, Russia-Ukraine war, but this is a European war, isn't it? If Putin is not stopped here, he has some other plans for Europe and for the world, doesn't he?
Yes, we already touched a little bit his concept of historic Russia. And
Yeah.
once again, it's a public statement of his interest, not only back 10 years ago, but just literally 2 days or 3 days ago during his Security Council meeting. First, and second, just we remember what kind of proposals Putin moved in December year 2021 to the United States and to the NATO. And his proposal was very clear: to move NATO border to 1997 line of division, which means all those countries that became members of the Euro-Atlantic community must abandon this membership, according to Mr. Putin. Once again, it's not a fantasy. This is his official statement and official desire.
Very, very scary if that is one word to use. Let us finish with this. You're an economist. You also understand what this means to people. Money, cash. And all this stuff that Biden is doing, the West is doing, oh, they're trying to stop Putin. You have very clearly said, hey, look, you want to stop this war? Embargo on oil, gas exports, blockade of energy, cut financial ties, have serious penalties. If the world did that, Russian operations would cease almost immediately. Am I correct that this is your advice and your warning?
Yes, you're absolutely correct, but I would need to add, if the Western leaders, first of all, starting with the President Biden, would do it, Putin would be limited in his resources, and sooner or later he would be forced to stop this war. Unfortunately, Biden's policy led to increase of Russian GDP under Putin's command last year by 21% in dollar terms. This is a record increase in Russian GDP. It's a record increase in Russian export. It is a record increase in Russian export of oil and gas. This is a record increase in Russian government revenues, in Russian government expenditures, in Russian military expenditures. Biden's policy helped Putin to continue this war at much higher level with much more dynamics, with much more resources. So that is why the real policy of Mr. Biden is helping Putin to continue this war against Ukraine.
So he's arming, supposedly, Ukraine to defend itself against a regime that he's enabling.
Unfortunately, the amount of military aid that has been provided by Biden administration, first of all, there's only 1/3 of what U.S. Congress appropriated for this support. And this actually, it's a very small amount compared to any country that United States supported in any war. Like it is 5 times less than it was supported to Afghan's army, not to U.S. army in Afghanistan, but to Afghan's army. And we understand that Afghan's army during this war was fighting Taliban that have only some kind of the basic weapons, as they did not have any heavy equipment. And now Ukraine is fighting the second strongest army in the world for the last 10 years. And the amount of resources that is being given to Ukraine is absolutely inadequate to continue this war, even just for defense of Ukraine.
Very, very eyebrow raising. We don't hear this in our establishment media. Doctor, as a Russian who says that I just am going to ask a couple questions, I have this habit of asking a million more. This has to be the last one because we got to go. To the best of my memory, you have said that Putin needs to be tried. There needs to be a criminal case against him in The Hague, for instance, in the International Criminal Court. Do you stand by that?
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that we don't necessarily even need an answer to your yes. Dr. Andrei Illarionov, thank you so much for joining the Glazov Gang. From my heart to yours as the son of Soviet dissidents, thank you for standing for the right things, for the truth, for freedom for our country that we love so much, that are ruled by these bad people. Thank you for being on the front lines in terms of your speaking the truth and in terms of your fight for the Ukrainian people, for the Russian people. And we love you, and keep up the good fight, okay?
Thank you very much, Jamie, for inviting me, and thank you very much for such a thoughtful, professional, and deep conversation.
I really appreciate that.
Also very pleasant. Even it is a very serious and disturbing, but it was done in a very high manner.
I appreciate that, and for obvious reasons, you're very close to my heart. Our country is something that we share, and I prepared for this with my heart and soul. There's a lot of people on the edge of their seat right now watching this, and they might want to start following you, reading your work. Am I correct that, of course, they should go to the Center for Security Policy run by Frank Gaffney, and you also have a website, Illarionov, Illarionov, livejournal.com, correct?
Thank you very much for recommending. Yes, you're right. And also Facebook, and also Twitter, and also Telegram. So all these social networks are available, and you're very welcome. Everybody's very welcome to look and to check what's new in those resources.
Я очень благодарен. Вы прекрасный человек. Большое спасибо. Good night, my friend, and we hope to see you soon, okay? And thank you for watching the Glazov Gang this evening. Make sure you subscribe to the Rumble channel of the Glazov Gang and press instant notifications. And we'll see you soon. Good night.